So we've been in 1 Peter, and we're going to continue our time, even though it's Palm Sunday, we're going to continue our time in 1 Peter. We've been making good progress. And today we're going to talk about two things because our passage is talking about two things. And at first, they might not seem related, but they are. We're going to talk about suffering and defending our faith. And in regard to suffering, specifically, we're going to talk about suffering for righteousness' sake. That is to say, suffering for doing good, suffering for doing the right thing. So we've got kids. It's family worship. How are you doing, kids, this morning? All right. I got a couple questions specifically for y'all this morning. So have any of y'all ever done the right thing and then been given a reward for it? Yeah? Does that happen? Good. It should, right? Now, have any of you ever done the wrong thing and then been punished for it? Yeah, you're like, yeah, I definitely that one. Okay, here's a trickier one. Have you ever done the right thing and then still been punished for it? Okay, yeah, that can happen sometimes, right? I definitely have had that happen. I remember that happening when I was a kid. And probably most of us have been, maybe it's just simply you were lumped in with people who were misbehaving, even though you weren't. You were doing the right thing. Maybe it was in a class setting or even just with your own siblings. And they were like, hey, I don't care who was responsible for it. Everybody is now doing this, right? You know, you get something taken away or something like that, even though you might not have been participating in that. And I don't know if everybody knows this about me, but I think a lot of you do. I'm a pretty big nerd, pretty big fan of superheroes. And my favorite superhero is who? Does anybody know? Oh, good one. Sunday school answer. Jesus. That was good. I do love Superman. He is my first love, but my favorite is Spider-Man. Yep. My own daughter was just like, what? That's because I make them watch the new Superman movie all the time because it's really good. And you don't even have to be a fan of Spider-Man to know that one of his defining characteristics is that he often has a really hard time being both Peter Parker and Spider-Man. He has a hard time juggling those two things and gets him into trouble. But he keeps doing it because his Uncle Ben told him that with great power comes... See, just part of the zeitgeist. Everybody knows who Spider-Man is. But because of that, even when Peter does the right thing, he often suffers for it. So, because it's family worship and because the substitute teacher often shows a movie, I'm going to show a brief clip that shows what I mean from one of the best Spider-Mans, Spider-Man 2, 2004. So you don't need much setup beyond the fact that Peter is, as he often is, late for work as a pizza delivery guy. And his boss tells him if he doesn't make this next delivery on time, he's fired. And he has to make it like 41 New York City blocks in an unreasonable amount of time. So that's the setup. So let's take a look at what happens. Man, ultimate insult, just getting a pizza sticker ripped off your helmet. So once again, Peter Parker, Spider-Man, he does the right thing here. He realizes he can't make it in time, so he's already Spider-Man. That's convenient. But then there's literally two kids that are about to get hit by a truck, so he has to sort of stop what he's doing and go actually do the right thing and be Spider-Man and save these kids' lives, right? And he can't tell his boss, even though he has a very reasonable defense as to why he was late. He can't tell his boss, I was late because I'm actually Spider-Man. He just has to take it on the chin. And today, in our passage, we are confronted with the same reality that sometimes doing the right thing, we're going to be in a situation where that does nothing but get us in trouble. That's what Peter's talking about. And that's the reality for the churches in Asia Minor that are the recipients of Peter's letter. They're being encouraged about suffering even while they are doing good, even as they honor God and choose the right thing. And in that encouragement that Peter gives, there's also an important instruction on our Christian hope and how we reasonably can defend it even in those circumstances. And how we talk about it, how we defend it, even as we are misunderstood, insulted, and abused. So I want you to turn in your Bibles to 1 Peter 3, 13 through 17. That's our text this morning, so we're continuing right where we left off last week in chapter 3. So I'm going to read the whole thing in its entirety, and then we'll take it together in pieces. So now, who is there to harm you if you are zealous for what is good? But even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, you will be blessed. Have no fear of them, nor be troubled, but in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. Yet do it with gentleness and respect, having a good conscience, so that when you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame. For it is better to suffer for doing good, if that should be God's will, than for doing evil. May God bless today the reading and the hearing of his word. So there's obviously a lot here in these 5 verses, and we've already done a little bit of setup, but let's remind ourselves where we came from last week. John did an excellent job walking us through verses 8 through 12, and in it, we saw, and John pointed out, that there are 12 commands given. This is not an exhaustive list, but things like be tenderhearted, be humble, seek unity, don't repay evil for evil, and instead bless others. And essentially, all of those commands amount to do what's right. Do what is good. Don't do evil. Even when it's hard, do the right thing. So let's look at each verse and try and bring out some of these things. So verse 13, it says, now, who is there to harm you if you are zealous for what is good? Now, that word, now, Peter begins this section with, in the ESV, that's how it's translated, now. That word is just the Greek word kai, which usually means and or but. It's all over the place, obviously, in scriptures. Other translations will just leave it untranslated because it doesn't really fit as a typical and or but, and it can be other things contextually. And so really, in this case, it's almost more equivalent to a therefore. In view of what we just were told, in view of what we just heard. So we have a word for therefore, and he didn't use it, so that's why there's some debate on how to structure it. But I think ESV does a good job of saying now. The idea here is simply that this verse is very closely linked to the preceding verses, because the question is, who is there to harm you if you are zealous for doing good? And Peter has just affirmed in verse 12 that the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, which you may remember from last week was a quotation of Psalm 34. And of course, this is especially true in view of the final judgment, where those who live righteously will be rewarded and the wicked will be judged. And we also talked about that. So Peter says, now, and you can kind of parentheses, in view of the fact that the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, who is there to harm you if you indeed are zealous to be righteous yourself? So in view of that fact that the Lord's eyes are on the righteous, who can harm you if you too are zealous to be righteous? And now this is where we have to back up and think about the context of 1 Peter a little bit more. And so let's back up and ask a few things. So obviously, who's writing this letter? Peter, right? When did he write it? Any takers? Is this early in his Christian life, like right after Jesus died, or has some time passed? Some time has passed, that's right. Kids, good job. Yeah, he probably wrote it around AD 62 or 63, so this is a good 30 years later, right, from the beginning of the early church. So where is he writing from? Tradition holds that he was writing from Rome. There's also some textual evidence for that in chapter 5 that we'll get to eventually. And so the question is, and we've talked about this in weeks prior, let's see who remembers, who was emperor of Rome in AD 62 or 63? Nero. All right, Turner's not allowed to answer any more questions because he's going to know them all. You guys have to. So, Nero. What do we know about Nero from history generally? Good guy, bad guy? right? Everybody seems to at least be somewhat aware that Nero, not good guy, right? So why is that? Well, Nero has this reputation for being especially awful toward Christians, and honestly, that reputation is well earned. When the catastrophic Great Fire of Rome broke out in AD 64, it's well documented that the emperor needed a scapegoat, and he chose the Christians. The Christians started this fire. And this fire was super destructive. A lot of people died. A lot of districts of Rome were burned completely. But we need to clear up a common misconception. It's extremely unlikely that Peter is writing after that event. And just as important, there's no real historical evidence that Nero's persecution, as awful as it was, spread beyond the city of Rome itself. This was a localized persecution of Roman Christians. And it's certainly not spreading as far as Asia Minor, the region where he is sending this letter. So, in fact, Nero often gets labeled as the worst persecutor of early Christians, but it's probably just more accurate to say he's the most famous because he's contemporaneous to the apostles in the Bible. So just so you know, the most widespread and systematic persecutions came much later, like centuries later, under emperors like Decius and Diocletian. So if we're making like a worst emperors list when it comes to persecution, Nero is in the top 5, but barely cracks it because it gets way worse as Christianity becomes more known and more prevalent. So Karen Jobes, in her commentary on 1 Peter, puts it this way, because this is important. This is why I bring all this up. If Peter had asked during or after the persecutions of Nero, and who is going to harm you if you are zealous to do good, every Christian in the room probably would have shouted, Nero! Nero's going to harm us. He's burning people. He's lighting gardens with them, right? That hasn't happened yet. Very likely, it also did not happen outside of Rome. It is why Peter died and Paul died, because they were both in Rome when this did happen. But the writers or the recipients of this letter were probably not encountering that level of persecution. And so this is a really helpful insight because it means there isn't this big empire-wide persecution, which is kind of how I always thought about it, because a lot of our brains just go, oh yeah, this is the time of Nero. Nero really bad. Here's the bad things that he did. And kind of going, that hadn't happened yet is not usually how we kind of chronologically locate 1 Peter. So it's important to understand that these are ordinary believers dealing with everyday pressure, misunderstanding, and mistreatment. That's what's going on. More similar to what we endure than people in other much harder to reach places in the world that endure much more serious persecution. That will come, and it does come, but this is not what is in view as Peter is giving these exhortations. So some people read verse 13 and they think, oh, so it just means like do good and nothing bad will happen to you? That is definitely not what Peter is saying. Doing what is right doesn't always keep you from suffering. I think everybody that lives on this earth realizes that. But that's also not Peter's point at all. He doesn't treat suffering like it's rare. In fact, throughout the letter, we've already seen it's part of the normal Christian life in a fallen world. It's something that we should expect. So what he's saying is, even when the righteous suffer, it doesn't have the final word. If you're walking in God's will, nothing can ultimately harm you. The pain is real, but it's not final. In the end, God will vindicate his people. See, Peter is simply echoing the same idea that Paul gets at in Romans 8:31. If God is for us, who can be against us? If the eyes of the Lord are on you, then who can stand? Paul's not saying Christians won't face opposition here either, right? In Romans 8. Clearly they do. He's saying that no opposition can ultimately win. But suffering of the righteous is real. And Peter allows for that in the very next verse. Look at verse 14. But even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, you will be blessed. Have no fear of them, nor be troubled. Again, the even if here doesn't mean like in the very rare case that this happens. Peter assumes that suffering will come. His point is that even when it does, it won't have the final say. God's eyes are on his people, and in the end, he will bless them with eternal life. And Peter knows this firsthand. We know from the accounts in Acts that He's been beaten. He's been imprisoned. He's been hauled before authorities and questioned. He's seen fellow believers, fellow apostles put to death. And yet he says, when you do good and suffer for it, have no fear. Don't be troubled. So this have no fear of them, right? This idea, have no fear of them. Them here is simply the world, the opposition, those who persecute you out of ignorance. It's not a specific group. Peter is actually adapting a quote from Isaiah 8 using the Greek translation of the Old Testament, which is called the Septuagint, and then he's recontextualizing it here. But the meaning is the same. Don't be afraid of your enemies. Don't be like your enemies, but instead fear and honor the Lord. And this is what we see in verse 15. But in your hearts, honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. Yet do it with gentleness and respect. So this first part, in your hearts, honor Christ the Lord as holy. The honor doesn't start in the actions that they're asked to take. Where does it begin? In their hearts. And I always find this a little ironic. The go-to defend your faith verse, the one that gets kind of people like fired up about apologetics and knowing all the right answers, starts with a part that we maybe don't quote as much. Because Peter's not starting with arguments, he's starting with allegiance of your heart. The position of your heart towards Christ is the beginning of all of this. This isn't about knowing more facts, it's about honoring Christ as Lord. And I say that as a guy that loves knowing facts. The guy that gets a special hit of dopamine in his brain anytime I know a cool fact that I think other people don't know. I'm like, I want to say it so bad, right? That's me. And if I am making a defense of something that I know or believe, I love it. I love to argue. The stupider the argument, the better sometimes. I'm getting better at that as I get older at leaving things alone, not yucking other people's yums just because I like to fight about movies or books or ideas or, music, those things. But at my worst, I'm basically the Wicked Witch of the East, bro, like meme, for those of y'all that know what that is. If you don't, I'm not going to show you that. We already watched Spider-Man, but you can Google it afterwards. That's me, and you'll look at that. It's not flattering. And then I went to seminary, and I was like, it was like, oh, you've met debates. Have you met theology? And I was like, I didn't even know there were this many fights to have. I mean, hopes to defend, right? So imagine my surprise as I dig deeper into this text over the past few weeks, and I realize there actually isn't any mention in here about knowing more facts. So let me point out a few things that jumped out to me that I have missed in the past, that I think a lot of us also miss. I'm putting myself at the front of the line here, but when we hear this familiar verse in passing, I don't think we often slow down long enough to really take a look at what it's actually calling us to do and what it's actually saying. So first, we've already talked about the immediate context of this verse. The context is suffering for righteousness' sake. It's about suffering for doing good. This isn't some academic classroom debate. This is happening in the midst of unjust suffering. So that's the first thing. That completely kind of changes the entire way that we have to look at this. Second, the first command isn't, hey, so be ready to argue, know your stuff. It's to honor Christ as Lord in your heart. Everything else flows from that. If you don't start there, you're already off kilter. Third, the defense Peter talks about here is centered on hope. Not just what we believe in general, but the hope that is in us, especially when we're suffering unjustly. That's the defense that we are to mount. How do you have hope? Even now, how do you have hope? And fourth, the manner of the defense matters. So we don't defend with fiery, righteous indignation or disdain for our heathen opponents, but with gentleness and respect. We give a reasoned defense. And I think if we're honest, that's a very different picture than most of us have in mind when we speak about or hear about defending the faith. We want to see people get owned with all the facts, right? And I think it's kind of funny because the word here, defense, is Greek. It's apologia, which is like the word that we would get apology from. And so when you hear the word apologetics, it's coming straight from the Greek. And it really does mean a defense or a reasoned response. And so it works as a theological grid that we have. The grid of apologetics is about mounting a reasoned defense. But obviously the English word for apology, the meaning has shifted dramatically over time. And when we say apology today, we don't mean defense. We almost mean the opposite. We're not to be defensive when we apologize. We admit fault, we express regret, we admit guilt, owning that we were wrong, and we come with contrition, right? And yet, even though Peter is talking about the original meaning here, the defense meaning here, the tone of it should probably actually be closer to a modern day apology. It's not about being defensive, in other words. It's about being humble. It's about being gracious, gentle, not trying to win, not trying to prove that we are right, but giving a reason for our hope in a way that's marked by gentleness and respect and genuine humility before other people. And that's the other word that I kind of want to zoom in on for just a minute, and that's the word reason. Reason, the Greek here is the word logos, which is like a word that can mean a bunch of different things. And it's a really rich word and a huge range of meanings. But here in this context, it simply means a reason or a cause or a basis. The why behind something, the why. So when Peter says to give a defense for the hope that is in you, he's saying our hope isn't random, it isn't blind, it isn't just wishful thinking. It has a reason. It has a cause. And part of our calling as believers, Peter is saying, is to be ready, gently and respectfully, to show that our hope is not only real, but reasonable. It is reasonable to believe these things. And that's a hard thing for us. And we'll return to that idea in a minute, but let's keep reading for now. So this is verse 16. So it continues right after that, still mid-thought. Having a good conscience, so that when you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame. So this is still talking about the manner of our defense, continuing. So gentleness and respect, having a good conscience. Peter says, have a good conscience. What does that mean? It means if you're actually suffering for doing good, then you have a good conscience. If you are suffering for doing wrong, then okay, that's not a good conscience. You are now being punished. You are not suffering unjustly. That should take us back to what Peter said in chapter 2 when he was talking about servants. This is 1 Peter 2:20. For what credit is it when you sin and are beaten for it, if you endure? But if when you do good and suffer for it, you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. So if you're beaten because you sinned, if you suffer because you sinned, that's not a credit to you. That's just punishment being merited out, right? But if you suffer for doing good, and you endure, that's a gracious thing in the sight of God. So suffering for doing bad, consequences. Suffering for doing good, persecution. If you're going to represent Christ, you have to suffer with a clear conscience. Think about how this plays out. We've all seen when a Christian leader, a pastor, a public figure is exposed to, and there's some really bad hidden sin, an affair, whatever. And suddenly, the criticism comes. And it's not slander, it's true. They're being rightly accused. They're being rightly called out. And the damage isn't just personal, it reflects on Christ and his church as well. Their conscience wasn't clear, and now it's been laid bare, and the things that they said are now also called into question. And the same principle applies to us. If we are reviled because we've been hypocritical, then our opponents aren't put to shame. We are. But Peter says, live differently. Think back to all the virtues that were looked at in the previous verses last week. If we come in humbly, if we aim to live rightly before God and one another, if our conscience is clear, then those accusations don't ultimately stick. They're without evidence. So the world may still hurl them, right? They may repeat them over and over again. And you may still suffer for it. Peter is granting that. But in the end, they are the ones that are put to shame, not you. And now, sometimes you even see glimpses of this in life. There are moments when a consistent, gracious, humble response actually turns the tables. The accuser loses credibility. It does happen. But Peter's ultimate meaning here isn't this life. It's eternity. There is a final reckoning coming. And those who mock and slander and revile the people of God, even as they walk in humility and integrity through unjust suffering, those people will not have the last word. God will. God will. In 17, it says, "For it is better to suffer for doing good, if that should be God's will, than for doing evil." And this is really just Peter now stating explicitly what we've already seen. He said it back in 2:20, and we saw. He implied it again in verse 16 with the idea of having a good conscience. And now here, he says it plainly. Sometimes it's God's will that you suffer while you do good. And that's not an easy phrase to hear, but it's right there in the text. Sometimes doing the right thing costs you. Sometimes it costs you a relationship. Sometimes it costs you your reputation amongst a group of people. Sometimes it even costs you your job, your vocation, your livelihood. Whether you're Spider-Man delivering pizza or just trying to faithfully live out your faith in a normal 8 to 5, it can and does happen that you do the right thing and suffer for it. And Peter says, if that should be God's will, it is still far better than suffering because you sinned. Because that kind of suffering isn't punishment. It isn't God's judgment. It's the very kind of suffering that Jesus prepared his disciples for, and Peter for. Peter heard the instruction with his own ears in the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew 5, 10 through 12. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. In other words, when you suffer for doing what is right, you're not outside of God's will. You're standing right in the middle of it. Jesus said, this is going to happen, and you're going to be blessed when it does. which means the very moments that feel the most unfair are often the moments where our hope should shine the clearest. And that is exactly what Peter is calling us into. So let's talk about practically what that looks like for us this morning as we kind of shift into our application time. I think there are 3 applications from this text, and I'm kind of stealing John's move. The text has them in there. I don't need to try and make them more pithy or try and make something there that's not. So the first is just simply this. When you suffer, honor Christ as Lord. Honor Christ as Lord in your heart. That doesn't mean we ignore the injustice of it. We don't. We can't. Our brains literally aren't wired that way, are they? We know when we're suffering unjustly. We can feel it. We know it. And when evil is done to us, our first instinct is always going to be, hey, that's not right. That's not fair. And you know what? That's true. Peter isn't telling believers to repress that or to stuff that down or ignore that. He's not saying, pretend that doesn't matter, pretend that doesn't hurt. He's not minimizing injustice. God is a God of justice, and it is coming. But he is reframing it. He's saying, in your heart, honor Christ as Lord. Even when you suffer unjustly, honor Christ as Lord. Start there. And so maybe this morning you're thinking, yeah, that's easy for you to say. Evan, you work at a church. You're not out there. It's rough. Any time I mention Christ, my coworkers turn the whole thing and me with it into just a punching bag. I've just stopped trying. I hear you. Or maybe you're saying, I don't know how to not get angry. I don't know how to not feel hurt. I've been through real injustice that a lot of people haven't. And the idea of willingly stepping back into that, even for Christ, just feels so hard, almost impossible. I get that too. And more importantly, Peter got that. That's why we have to start here. If your heart is oriented first and foremost towards Christ, if he is the one you prize above your reputation, your comfort, your sense of being right, then something begins to shift. Our focus changes, our perspective changes, and we begin to see him not as some faraway God that's asking us to do the impossible, but our great high priest, like Hebrews 4:15 said, the one who has been tempted in every way that we have been, the one who has been reviled, insulted, mocked far more than any of us will ever be. He is not asking us to do something that he didn't do himself. So when you suffer, he isn't distant from you in that. He's with you. And he's saying, you honor me when you don't return evil with evil. When you love your enemies. When you pray for those who persecute you. You honor me. And here's the good news, church. You don't have to manufacture that on your own. You can't. But he will help you do it. But it starts with a heart that's oriented around him, not ourselves. And so next, when you suffer, honor Christ as Lord, and be ready to speak about your hope. This does not mean that you need to have every answer to every question that could possibly be asked of you. But it does mean that your hope is something you have thought about. Not just felt feelings about, not just experienced at church, but something that you have dug into and thought about. It's something you understand and can speak to. And if you're sitting there thinking, well, I don't feel ready for that, that's okay. That's exactly where growth starts. One of the most helpful books that I have read on this is The Reason for God by Timothy Keller. And I would commend this to you this morning, all of you, anybody in here. This book is for you. And it's an outstanding book if you have ever wrestled with the harder questions about faith or wondered how to talk about them well with other people. Keller was a trusted voice who passed away in 2023, and he was deeply respected, not just for what he taught, but for how he lived. Trey and I were talking about this week, about how he really embodied the kind of posture that Peter is calling us to here. Honoring Christ as Lord and engaging others with humility and a clear conscience. He's not one of those guys that after he died, a bunch of bad stuff came out about him. He's not that. He's respected. And in a time like ours, when everything feels pretty divided, his voice is sorely missed because it's compassionate and kind and gentle. And Keller makes the point that faith that's never been questioned is actually very fragile. And if you never wrestle with hard questions, your own doubts, as well as the objections of others, your faith won't hold up well when it's tested. When you are suffering, you won't know how to give a reasoned defense. But when you do that work, when you wrestle honestly and openly, your hope becomes grounded and reasoned. And therefore, it becomes more reasonable to you and others. It becomes something you can actually explain. You don't need lofty speech. You don't need big words. You just need to be able to answer simply and directly, why do you still have hope, even in all this suffering? You need to be able to say, because I'm forgiven, because this isn't the end, because my hope doesn't come from a place or a platform or platitudes. It's in a person. And I'd love for you to meet him. That's what Peter is calling us to do. And third, when we suffer, respond in a way that actually looks like him. Because here's the thing. How you say it matters just as much as what you say, sometimes more. Peter says, with gentleness and respect and a good conscience. And that's where this gets really challenging. And I like to remind myself that this is the Apostle Peter here writing about gentleness and respect, and this is the dude, standing there with a sword, slicing ears off, when people are trying to take Jesus. That's the same dude. This dude is a fighter. But that same fighter watched Jesus heal that man, that enemy, that soldier who led him away to his death. Do you think that made an impression? Peter learned, just like we have to learn, that the goal isn't to win these arguments. It's not to prove someone wrong. It's not to own the argument. We cannot persuade people to love Jesus. We cannot do it. We cannot ask them to hope in what we hope for. But when we give our reasoned defense, we can look like him. And this is where Keller's insight, and even just his tone, is so helpful. This is from the opening introduction of Reason for God. I'm going to read it's a longer quote, but it's powerful. He says, a faith without some doubts is like a human body without any antibodies in it. People who blithely go through life too busy or indifferent to ask hard questions about why they believe as they do will find themselves defenseless against either the experience of tragedy or the probing questions of a smart skeptic. A person's faith can collapse almost overnight if she has failed over the years to listen patiently to her own doubts, which should only be discarded after long reflection. Believers should acknowledge and wrestle with doubts, not only their own, but their friends and neighbors. It is no longer sufficient to hold beliefs just because you inherited them. Only if you struggle long and hard with objections to your faith will you be able to provide grounds for your beliefs to skeptics, including yourself, that are plausible rather than ridiculous or offensive. And just as important for our current situation, such a process will lead you, even after you come to a position of strong faith, to respect and understand those who doubt. That's the posture. That's the manner. It's not arrogance. It's not defensiveness. It's not trying to win. It's not being irritated or angry. It's humility, patience, respect, because you understand what it's like to wrestle with these things too. So when you suffer, honor Christ as Lord in your heart. Be ready to speak about your hope and respond in a way that actually looks like Him. Because when the world is unreasonable, a reasonable hope lived with humility stands out.